Hey, Dr. Mike here. Did you know that some people in their 90s have the memory of a 20-year-old? Well, stay tuned to find out the secrets to their ageless brain.
You're listening to Live Foreverish, a show dedicated to helping you live just a little longer. Here's your hosts, Dr. Mike and Dr. Crystal Gossard.
All right, welcome to Live Foreverish. I'm your host, Dr. Mike, and of course, I'm here with Dr. Crystal. We've got a special guest here today talking about the Mindspan diet. That's very interesting, Dr. Crystal. I need some help. With my mind, getting up there, having the little brain farts here and there.
Well, I feel confident that our guests will be able to help you and help me and help many of you listening as well.
All right, so our guest is Dr. Preston Estep. He is the Director of Gerontology at the Personal Genome Project at Harvard Medical School. He has founded or is a scientific advisor on many leading biotech startup companies, and he is the author of the book, The Mindspan Diet. Dr. Estep, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we start off? We hear the word diet all the time, and I think for what we're going to talk about, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Estep, that's not really the direction we're going to go. So tell us what you mean right off the bat for the audience. The main concept behind Mindspan.
Well, so first of all, diet is often used to mean weight loss, right? That's the typical use of the word diet, but especially in the publication of popular books. But a diet really historically has meant a way of life. And so I think diet, you're using the sort of ultra traditional usage of the term diet is really appropriate here, because Mindspan diet describes not just it's actually not at all about losing weight. It's about a lifestyle built around a style of eating and certain foods that people have eaten traditionally. Yeah. And so Mindspan means the longevity of your mind. And so there are a lot of books and a lot of philosophies and concepts that focus on longevity eating or longevity diets. But one of the things that I was dissatisfied with when I read those books and when I considered these different philosophies is that they didn't consider how well your mind performed, how engaged you were, how well your memory worked over that duration of your lifespan. So I created this concept called Mindspan to extend this concept of lifespan, because I thought that lifespan was not really the important goal that all of us are trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve Mindspan, which means long lifespan of a high performance mind.
Yeah, so tell us about the typical Mindspan. Like when you were looking at the research, even with the longevity studies and seeing people who live longer, maybe their minds weren't keeping up with those years. What would you say would you characterize as the typical mind span? And then the next thing would be, how many healthy years could we potentially add on? When I say healthy years, healthy mind years, could we potentially add on?
So let's start with overall longevity or lifespan. Or life expectancy, which is a typical measure of how public health agencies sort of measure how well people live, how long they live. So global life expectancy at birth for women is longer than men. It's about 75 years globally and about 70 for men. Unfortunately, COVID is going to reduce that for many developed countries for the first time in their histories. But for women in the U.S., pre-COVID, life expectancy was 81 years, for men 77. So about a 4 or 5 year difference. But there's again, going back to this concept of Mindspan versus lifespan, in the U.S. and many developed countries, especially Northern and Western European countries, there's a very high burden of dementia, of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, that reduces the functional lifespan or reduces the mind span. So if you compare the longevity of the Japanese, who are the longevity leaders of the world, women live about 87 years, men about 81. So there's about six plus year difference, probably mainly due to heavier smoking by males. But they have a very low burden of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. So it's not only do they live several years longer, but they are more cognitively intact. Their memories function much better in older age. So the overall difference between the typical Japanese and the typical, or just historically at least, the typical Japanese and the typical American is that you get about a decade of difference, not only in lifespan, but in cognitive performance.
Wow. I wasn't expecting that many years for you to tell us that, because it just seems like, even when you are doing the right things, you're following a healthy lifespan, a lot of times the genetics start kind of coming into play. And so would you say that what you're doing with the Mindspan diet or this approach, is it combating genetics, or, what are you seeing as some of the underlying mechanisms related to the increased mind span?
So we know that genetics plays a role. My background is in genetics. I'm a geneticist, genome scientist. My PhD is in genetics, and so I actually came at this problem from the perspective of genetics. But I found in my research and I read a lot of very high quality research that suggested that genetics actually plays a minority role in overall longevity and mind span. And some of the most convincing evidence we have of that is studies in which people move from one country to another, and they adopt local customs, local lifestyle, local diets. And so typically when a Japanese person moves out of Japan, they bring their traditional lifestyle and diets with them. So the first generation eats very similarly to the way that people eat in Japan, and their mind spans, their longevity doesn't change much. But their children and their grandchildren, they typically start to have more of the lifespan and mind span of the local community to which they moved. So, for example, Japanese who move to Hawaii, they start to acquire a lifespan and mind span, or dementia rates that are more typical for Hawaii. So we know that lifestyle, environmental factors like lifestyle and diet are more important than genetics. And so it's also true that people who move to Japan and adopt Japanese lifestyles and diets start to have extended longevity and greater mind span. And the same is also true of the Mediterranean. People who move to or from the Mediterranean, if they move to the Mediterranean, then their mind spans or lifespans increase, and if they move out, they generally decrease. So we know that genetics is not a dominant factor.
Yeah. I was just going to say that it only takes about a generation for people for McDonald's to start winning over the kids and the grandkids. That seems about right. I want to talk a little bit about some of the typical foods that we should be eating more for a longer mind span, but then I also want you to address, how do we get the standard American to move from the standard American diet to something that's going to increase mind span? Because that, at the end of the day, as a clinician, Dr. Estep, that's what I'm faced with. All of this is great. It's great research. It makes sense. But at the end of the day, how do we get people to incorporate all this in their daily lives?
That's a very complex question. There are governmental measures, there are public health measures, and some in some countries, those kinds of measures are very effective. In the U.S., they're not very effective, unfortunately. People have a diversity of views and habits that differ substantially from governmental regulations or recommendations. And so, there's not a lot we can do. But one of the things that we can do is that we can address the foods directly. To get to your, to the heart of your question, what do these Mindspan Elite, what I call the Mindspan Elite, the people who have the greatest mind spans in the world, what do they eat, and how might the government, affect that, the food supply so that people are eating better foods. So the surprising thing that I found when I started researching, these people, these Mindspan Elite, was that they, contrary to the prevailing opinion of the time and currently, they eat a lot of carbohydrates. They eat most of their food energy comes from purified carbohydrates. So in the case of the Japanese, it's white rice, right? We're told repeatedly that foods like white rice are really bad for us, that they do terrible things. They raise our cholesterol, they raise our blood sugar, that they undermine our health in a variety of ways. But traditionally, the traditional Japanese, all I can tell you for sure, looking at the evidence, is that the majority of the food energy that comes, that is present in the Japanese diet is white rice. So that raises a really important question, right? Yeah. And that question is their white rice the same as ours?
That's an interesting point. And I noticed that I read that you, along with identifying the white rice, you kind of identify other myths, things that we kind of think are good and we may want to question, or these concepts. And I'm a clinical nutritionist, so yes, I'm one of those ones preaching stay away from the white rice, but now it gives you a different perspective. And I knew that you had other ideas related to protein and iron. Can you talk about that a little bit as well?
Yeah, absolutely. But getting back to this issue of this question of is the Japanese white rice the same as the American white rice? This is sort of the fundamental scientific process, right? You find something that doesn't agree with your model, right? You've been told repeatedly, and the data show repeatedly, that white rice is not good for our health. So there's this nagging question, right? How do the Japanese eat so much of this stuff, and yet they're the healthiest people in the world with the lowest dementia, the greatest mind span? So when you look deeply into this issue, you find that Japanese white rice has never been enriched. And what I mean by enriched is that in the U.S. and many developed countries, we enrich our rice to add nutrients back that are stripped out in the purification process. So when you make white rice, you're stripping off the outer hull and the bran. And what many nutritionists say is the most nutritious part of the rice, most of the fiber is gone. But one of the key things that you find is that most of the iron's gone too. And what we've decided in the West is that it's important to replace that iron. So many European countries, the U.S., we actually mandate. Since the end of World War II, it actually started a little bit before that, from sort of the Depression era. There was a move toward the enrichment of foods. There was a law put in place in many countries, including the U.S., that mandated the replacement of iron in foods in which it was removed, particularly grain products. So almost all of the white rice sold in the U.S. and consumed in the U.S. is enriched with iron. And in the Mindspan Elite countries in Mediterranean and Japan, their rice and their pasta and their breads, they've never had any enriched grain products.
I mean, it makes sense when you talk about the iron, right? As somebody who recommends a lot of supplementation for people, unless you're anemic, there's really not much of a need to be adding in iron, but yet we do that in as you just say, the rice. And yeah, people, if you eat a lot of that, that's a pro-oxidant. I mean, that's gonna cause some issues. So I never really thought of it, but it makes sense.
It is the most abundant and most potent pro-oxidant in the body.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Okay. Now we gotta. Okay, from a government level, like we were just talking about, how do we make that change? I mean, that's something, taking away additives and stuff, I think is very difficult to do. So do we just get a bunch of rice from Japan?
I know.
I buy non-enriched rice. I buy it. I buy both. I buy Asian rice, Japanese and Korean, and I also buy Indian, Pakistani rice, basmati rice. So you can get imported. A lot of imported rices are not enriched. So I encourage everybody who eats rice, and I do encourage people to eat rice. It's really a great food. You have to eat the right rice, though. You not just avoid enrichment, but you have to also know which rice is the best kind of rice. So in the Mindspan diet, I lay out all the guidelines for which rices are best for your diet. But the key parameter, I think, two key parameters are low glycemic index and not enriched with iron.
Gotcha.
Now, what are other core eating principles of the Mindspan diet?
So getting back to your question about protein, one of the surprising things that I found about protein, it's actually not too surprising given if you are educated in the calorie restriction literature, but more typically a more common dietary recommendation is to have a high protein diet, and that helps with weight loss. But the fact is that people of the Mindspan Elite have a very low protein diet. And not only do they have a low protein diet, but there's a very big difference between animal sources of protein and plant protein.
Yeah.
And in the calorie restriction research community, it's very well known that there are certain amino acids that are much more abundant in animal proteins that actually have been implicated in accelerated aging. So if you can actually recapitulate a calorie restricted diet by simply restricting certain individual amino acids that are very abundant in animal protein foods, like red meat.
Wow. So, all right. So we have the rice.
So I got to change a lot
here. Lots of discoveries here. Yes, I'm trying to kind of put it all together. So rethinking rice, rethinking carbohydrates, I think is what I'm hearing, especially the enriched versions. Kind of rethinking protein and focusing more on plant-based sources of protein. Is that what I'm hearing? Versus animal-based?
Really, you got to be really careful these days, because one of the things that's happened in the last few years is that plant-based foods have started to become hyper enriched with iron. It's actually a long tradition of hyper enriching plant-based foods with iron. Starting with breakfast cereals. Most breakfast cereals that you see are enriched with iron. Right. Some of them give you like 100% of your daily value of iron in a single serving. So avoid those at all costs. But one of the things that concerns me now is this plant-based meat replacement movement, with Impossible Foods and Beyond meats. The reason that those plant-based meats taste like beef is because they're hyper-enriched with iron.
There you go. So we've got to be careful
Yes.
with those as well. Our guest is Dr. Preston Estep. He's the author of the Mindstep Diet. Just to kind of summarize for the audience, Dr. Estep, what would you like for them to know ultimately about what you're doing, what your focus is here in the Mindspan lifestyle?
So my primary focus is longevity of the mind. People want to live long, right? It's a really important goal for most of us, but we don't want to live into years of dementia. We don't want to lose our faculties, our memories, because those aren't quality years, right? Then we're essentially not truly alive. So to achieve that, I think it's important to know the diet has been shown to be the number one most important variable, and that iron is probably the single most important variable within the diet. And if you get too much iron, you're overloading with the most abundant and potent pro-oxidant in the body.
Yeah.
And so that kills not just your cells in your vasculature and your other tissues, but it also in your brain. So you have to be very, very careful with your iron intake. But it's also really important to understand that there is no one size fits all, right? Some people are iron deficient, and they actually need a fairly high iron diet. So the first step in really creating a precision medicine solution for yourself is to measure your body iron stores, to know how much iron is in your body, to decide what your diet should be and whether or not you should supplement.
Yeah.
And so the way you do that, there are a few different tests that you can take, but unfortunately, they're not the typical tests that most physicians give you at your annual physical. So you have to actually know which test to take and know how to interpret those numbers to know whether or not you should be on a lower or higher iron diet.
Gotcha.
And that would be the ferritin and the transferrin. Is that what you're referring to?
That's right.
Okay.
Dr. Estep, where can any audience member go and purchase your book? Where is it available?
You can get it on Amazon. You can get it on other online bookstores. It's harder to find in brick and mortar bookstores these days because it's several years old. But you can find it online, and it's also on in an audio version and large print and 7 different languages.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on today. By the way, you can also read an article about all this, right? At lifeextension.com/Mindspan. Dr. Crystal, thanks for joining me today. Great show. By the way, liveforeverish.com, load it with a bunch of podcasts. I don't even know what the count is anymore. There's a lot. So go check it out. You can download, like, share, comment, and of course, subscribe so you never miss a show. That's liveforeverish.com. I'm Dr. Mike. Thanks for listening.